I wanted to spend some time talking about Alistar, who obviously we used to climb to Diamond 3. We showed some of the stats earlier. That's where we peaked last season. We ended up Diamond 4. Kind of fell down towards the end. But what I wanted to discuss was that, like, when I go on like YouTube or just generally there's like discussion about support, there's a lot of information thrown at people about what they should be doing, how they should be doing it. And I don't find personally that that's very useful, because when you are thinking about how you want to climb, at least for me, I like to think about it as one concept at a time. So what I mean by that is I don't load up a game thinking, okay, I'm going to do really good with wave control. I'm going to do really good with control, with warding. I'm going to do really good with like objective control. I'm going to do really good with my micro. I'm going to do really, you know what I mean? Like there's like so many things in this game that you can think about that if you think about any more than like 2 or 3, it becomes extremely overwhelming in terms of, you know, what you should be working on. And so it's very easy with my brain, at least. I'm talking from my experience. Maybe you guys relate to this, maybe you don't. But for me, when it becomes so overwhelming, it becomes very easy to then say, okay, I lost the game. This sucks. I'm not doing it again. Because it's the simple solution to what's going on in your game, right? So you lose sight of the concept you're trying to work on to do properly to climb when you're trying to do 12 things at once. And so then, because you're doing 12 things at once, you're not really thinking about any of them individually, like with too much granularity. Your brain defaults back to like, did I win? Did I lose? If I lost, I played poorly. I'm never doing those things again, which is a huge, huge barrier to climbing, in my opinion. I still do it. I do it all the time. But for me, when I look at YouTube videos and you're given 15 things to work on, you're not given a clear understanding of how to go about working on them. And so it becomes overwhelming and the videos aren't that useful. So today what I wanted to do in just like a quick hits type thing was to look at Alistar, because that's the only champion I can speak to with any sort of authority. I mean, obviously like Diamond 3 isn't great, still puts me in like the top 2%, but I think we were ranked like 200th in NA on Alistar, which is, again, not fantastic, but certainly not shitty compared to like the general population, at least. So I just wanted to talk about like what I'm seeing in season 14 so far, what I'm building, and generally what to think about as you're picking runes and items specifically. So we're not even going to get into like anything in game. I just wanted to make a video that quickly covers what runes to use when and why, and what items to use when and why, and that's it. And try to give some thoughts on how to think about when to use these things that are like pretty basic and simple. So hopefully this is interesting. I don't know. So we'll start with runes. When you come into his rune page, and we're looking at League of Graphs, we're on Diamond Plus, but there are a couple of different pages that are used. So I will right out of the jump say in season 13, we almost only used this page in lowelo, and this is almost the only page we used to climb, frankly. So we went Aftershock, Font of Life, Bone Plating, Unflinching, with Hex Flash, Cosmic Insight, Ability Haste, and then these two are interchangeable. Future Kuze here, just wanted to check in right as we were editing this. There made some changes to the runes down here at the bottom for ability haste. We were talking about armor versus magic resist, and if you click into them now, we actually have some new options, so I just wanted to cover those really quickly as they've changed. At the top, we still want to go for ability haste. You still have adaptive force, attack speed, and ability haste as your options. These haven't really changed. However, in the second and third options, there are some new choices. Adaptive force was already there, and there was also health, although this is now health scaling. We also have movement speed as an option, and then in the final third option, we have base health, scaling health, and then we have tenacity and slow resist. Goes without saying that in the third option here, we want tenacity and slow resist for some of the reasons I've covered with unflinching. It's just going to be the best option. You can make an argument that the standard health up front might be good just for the passive healing to sustain in lane. Maybe, but realistically,
plus 10% tenacity and slow resist is a lot of slow resist and a lot of tenacity, and you really don't want to lose that. So I'm taking that in almost all cases. For the reasons we've covered already with water walking, Moby boots, some of the trailblazer itemization as well, you generally are going to want to take movement speed on Alistar as well, just because it's going to be the best base stat for him here. You could try and take adaptive force if you're trying to, go all in a little bit heavier in the lane potentially, but realistically, this seems like the safest of the runes. So just wanted to cover this really quickly. Let's head back to the video. Obviously right now the popularity is down a lot, but let me talk to you about why I use this, and then we'll talk about this other build and why it's useful. So first things first, I just want to talk about like the runes, and why you use them. So Aftershock, pretty simple. After mobilizing an enemy champion, you increase your armor and magic resist by 35 plus 80% of bonus resist for 2.5 seconds. You then explode, dealing magic damage to nearby enemies. It cools down in 20 seconds. So this is pretty obvious. You're WQing in. Once you've WQ'd in, that's an immobilization when you knock them up, and so you're getting additional armor and magic resistance at that point, so that you don't die immediately, right? Font of Life works in tandem with your WQ as well. You're impairing the movement of an enemy champion with WQ, and then allied champions who are attacking that marked enemy is healing. Particularly useful for lane phase, right? Because generally you're going on one target, hopefully your ADC is attacking that target, and you're going to get a lot of value there. Obviously there's value late game too, but late game you're going to get like 2-3 knockups, and so that's even better actually in some ways, because all of them are going to have Font of Life on them, so you'll get some healing for your team. Bone Plating, pretty straightforward. After taking damage from an enemy champion, the next 3 spells or attacks you receive, they deal less damage. This is just a good cooldown to play around in lane. Later on, not as useful. And then Unflinching. Obviously a big one for tenacity and slow resist. I, at the beginning of the season, actually didn't use this too much, and I'll talk about that in just a second. Let's get through the rest of them first, and then we can talk about like how you can vary this based on what you're seeing. Hex Flash for me in our secondary rune tree is a absolute necessity for Alistar. You're going to be bouncing out of bushes, jumping out of bushes and shit. Hex Flash is fantastic. The one thing I would say when you're starting to play Alistar is in the post-game rune breakdown, track how many times you use your Hex Flashes. Because if you're not using it a lot, you're probably doing something wrong. Early on in the season, when I really hadn't played a ton of Alistar, I was looking at that data and it's like I had Hex Flash like once or twice all game. That's probably not enough. You probably want it to be like in the 3 to 4 range. And if you're not doing it, there could be a good reason as to why, like you're counter engaging or something. But generally, like between like level 1, level 8, you're probably going to be using this to jump out of bushes and stuff. Particularly in the new season where the jungle is like that much more complex and there's a lot of walls you can Hex Flash over. So another great use for this is like Hex Flashing from the dragon pit to hit the blasting plant, things like that, or to escape the dragon pit. Just useful. And then Cosmic Insight, obviously you want Summoner Spell Haste for your ult if you can get it. Same with Ability Haste here. And then as I said, down here, this can vary. So like, if you go double armor, it's because the support that you're going into, this is really about support. So if you're going into like a Draven, you're double armoring probably. But magic resist I've found is really useful, particularly this season if you have like a Teemo support or Xerath or Vel'Koz, things that are going to poke you out. Brand, magic resist, super useful, and you should think about taking it. That's like the logic around most of the stuff that's here. Now, there are, first of all, let's talk about Unflinching. So early in the season, I used Overgrowth instead. And so what this does for those of you who aren't, they don't take the time to read these, don't blame you. They're like complicated and it's just easier to use like generally what you're told to use. But you gain maximum health for every 8 minions that die. And so what I found is generally in like a 30-minute game, you get the equivalent of 1 ruby crystal when you use Overgrowth. Now, the reason that that's useful on Alistar is this passive heals based on maximum health. So if you're in a matchup where there really isn't a reason to have tenacity, and there's not a lot of them these days, but sometimes there are, like if there's no real point to having slow resist, you might think about taking this, but to be honest, I generally just take Unflinching and it's fine. I tried playing around with Revitalize as well because technically the passive does heal, and I thought maybe, hey, 5% additional heal on Revitalize, maybe that's good. I found it was not very good compared to the other 2 options. Unfortunately, like all 3 options in here are all really useful for Alistar. Yeah, comparatively, if we go through the rest of these, like
Bone plating is an obvious one because second wind we don't really care about because we have our passive heal. Conditioning, we don't really care about because, you know, additional armor, magic resist late game. We're not like really a late game champ. Demolish is good, but Font of Life is better. And Shield Bash, we don't really have a shield on Alistar, so that doesn't really make sense. But yeah, so this is generally the page I would go. Now, there's a couple of problems with this page that are solved by, there's actually a build down here that's actually not bad either. But there's a problem with this page that, particularly in this season, that this page solves better. And you see that this is a more popular page. So let's talk about why. So this page here, for me, is you are playing as a main tank. If you're like a World of Warcraft guy, you're the main tank with this. Like, you don't really have a lot of support in your front line. You need to be making plays. You need to be soaking damage. This is the page you should go with. Now, if you find that you're in a team that has, like, I like to use this page a lot. I found it synergizes really well with like Singed. Galio is another good one. Any sort of like slow or frontline additional bruiser type champ, Volibear. This is something you might consider taking, and you see that it's taken a lot. And there's a couple of reasons you take it. So first of all, Glacial Augment, obviously, you know, when you WQ in, you're going to slow for 20%. So that's super useful for anyone. If you're in like an Ashe lane as well, I found that this is pretty nice because you slow them, then Ashe jumps up, her passive slows, and then you can just run people down, right? So if you're doing a lot of chasing, you see in your pregame lobby, you're probably going to be doing a lot of chasing, Glacial Augment is a good call. And generally, when you make that decision, you see that, there's another reason you would take this, which is for minion dematerializer. So one of the big drawbacks to this is if you go into an enchanter matchup as Alistar, you want to go for a level 2 all-in lane almost all the time. However, it's really difficult to basically get your support stacks off, particularly for cannons. Minion dematerializer helps with that a ton. Even if it's like 1 or 2, ideally you use all 3. But sometimes you're roaming and stuff come level 6 or 7. Maybe you don't even use them all, but it just helps mitigate the damage you take in lane phase because you don't have to like greed for a cannon with this. Helps a ton. You see some people also take Biscuit Delivery if they're not as worried about that. I could see that working, but I never really used it. Minion Dematerializer is super useful. Obviously, you keep Hex Flash and Cosmic Insight, which is what we had down here in our secondary. And then on our secondary, which is now our Resolve Rune, you keep Bone Plating and Unflinching, and you get rid of Font of Life. This is kind of interesting. Like, I would say Bone Plating you probably are going to need for lane phase. I haven't played around with this too much, but the same logic for Unflinching applies, which is that if you see a matchup where like you don't really need the Tenacity, you might think about taking Font of Life for the healing for the rest of your team. However, again, most of the time Unflinching you're going to need it just because there's so much like slow and just shit that you need Tenacity for, honestly. Yeah, and then down here again, this is super flexible. I think everybody sort of knows this, but if you are in one of these matchups, generally I'm taking it for Minion Dematerializer to help out my lane phase so I don't get completely poked out. Into Brand, into Vel'Koz, into Xerath, Magic Resist is going to be really good. So, good page. Now, another thing you can do is this third page, and I think after this I don't really go like this one doesn't work that well for me. I know it's got a decent win rate, but I suck with this. This is a third rune page that I find to be pretty useful. You can think about this as being like kind of like the squishiest page, obviously, because you don't have Bone Plating, you don't have Unflinching. So if you have like a really strong top lane and you are going to be you have like a pretty good front line, but you're not as worried about like a slow, this is something you might take, and there's a couple really big advantages to this. So first of all, you get the movement speed with Phase Rush, obviously. Nimbus Cloak is super useful, largely for the first part of it. So you gain a movement speed increase that lasts for 2 seconds and allows you to pass through units after casting a summoner spell. So when you disengage off of WQ, your routing can get really screwy, and this just solves that problem. So if you're worried about disengaging quickly, this is a super useful rune for Alistar. Obviously for celerity, additional movement speed, and you're kind of thinking about this build sort of like almost like Rakan, like thinking about movement speed. Water Walking is super useful for roaming. This is a rune that I wish I could find a better way to incorporate like into one of these other two, but this really doesn't work. But Water Walking is a great rune in this tree. Then you keep Hex Flash and you keep Cosmic Insight. And essentially what you're doing here is you're giving yourself a ton of playmaking capability, and you are sacrificing your ability as a frontliner. So like this is if you're thinking about it in like World of Warcraft, I don't know why I think about it this way, but I do. This is main tank, this is off tank, and then this is just like playmaking. I don't know what it would be like, like rogue, like you're just trying to make a play. Like you're getting your WQ in, and then you're just getting out. Like maybe you're hex flashing over the wall, WQing, which triggers Nimbus Cloak and triggers water walking if you're in the river, as well as phase rush. You're coming out of nowhere, you're running really quickly, and you're engaging into folks. So these three are like, for me, like the ones that you would almost always use. I don't know what's going on down here. I don't really care because they cover most of the conditions. But for low elo, I really recommend this one because it's the most gentle in terms of dying. And obviously as support, at least the way I play support, trying to minimize your deaths, this is going to allow that to happen. You still have playmaking capabilities with Hex Flash or Hex Flash, just because you can come over walls and stuff. And then really the only thing that and also you don't have to really worry about team comp quite as much. Whereas this, you have to do a little bit more critical thought and think about like, okay, what do I get from an indie materializer? Is it good enough that I want to lose like survivability later? And that's why I'm saying this is like an off tank build, because your survivability later is not as problematic if you have somebody else up in the front line with you, generally like a top laner or a jungler. So that's generally how I'm sort of thinking about runes. But again, I would say like 99% of the time I'm locking this one in just because it's the easiest to think about and play with. And most of the time, particularly in low elo, people are going to play flashy champions that don't have a ton of survivability and have a ton of burst. And you want to obviously protect them, but also empower them to make plays. And that's what Hex Flash gives you. Particularly in this meta this season, people blow up a lot faster than they used to. So this will give you a little bit of additional survivability, whereas like a page like this, man, if you don't get out immediately after engaging, you are super dead. Obviously, items can change this fact though, so let's talk about that. So we can see that like generally there is a most popular route to take, and it's pretty consistent across almost every engage support at the moment. We saw it actually as we were looking at Nautilus. People were rushing Locket of the Iron Solari, and then going into like Zeke's or Knight's Vow. Frozen Heart is really popular right now, but from what I'm reading, it's largely because of how much it costs, and I think they're going to make it slightly more expensive. And then another really great item is Trailblazer. So I've talked about this on stream before. There's a little bit more gold income, it feels like, this season versus last. Last season, I think we did like the data and we ran the numbers, and I would say like in a 30-35 minute game in almost every condition, we were at like between 1.5 and 2 items. Now I feel like we're generally at the same time. We're about 2 to 2.5 items just in terms of like the additional gold that we're getting from the new support items. And obviously there's a nice additional benefit in that the support items are a little bit more useful than they were historically. So, there's a little bit more to think about here, but realistically, you talk about on almost every other role, like what's your full build, what's your 5 items. On support, it's really just 3+ control words for the most part. I mean, so that's something else to keep in mind. Support item 1-2, support item 1-2, and maybe a third if the game goes really late. So personally, what I've been doing is down here. I play Alistar as like a big roaming champion. I always have. Early on in the season, I tried to like be a lane bully with him, and I'm just not good enough at finding those conditions to engage. Also, there's a lot more thought that has to go in the 2v2 matchup. I found that by having pretty good understanding of wave control, you can just roam and find plays elsewhere. And in games where you're with like a crappy ADC or something, it doesn't make as much of a difference if they're good or not, which is super helpful. So what I've been doing is rushing my Winged Moonplate. Obviously, the additional move speed is really useful, and having the health crystal helps Alistar's passive with the passive heal that we were talking about before. Last season, you would generally go back and get boots and a ruby crystal as well, so there's some familiarity there for me personally and for most Alistar players, in that you sort of have the same items when you come back on your first or second back, generally your first. But maybe sometimes you back and get boots first, or just the crystal or whatever. So you get a nice additional movement speed buff. From there, I generally finish Trailblazer, which again, giving me move speed, I want to be as quick around the map as possible, even regardless of what runes I'm using. I'm trying to make plays across the entire map. And then from there, I normally go Zeke's, and the reason I go Zeke's is Frostfire Tempest now is different than it was last season. So when you cast your ultimate, you're summoning a storm around you for 5 seconds. It deals 50 magic damage per second, which I don't really care about, but it slows enemies by 30%, which I do care about. And unlike Nautilus, what we were just playing, 9 times out of 10, maybe not that much, 8 times out of 10, I'm popping my ult when I'm about to engage or I've just engaged, to either clear any debuffs that are on me, slows, roots, things like that. So I'm already in the fight most of the time, and this Frostfire Tempest buff when I pop my ult is going to be really, really useful in terms of helping my team catch enemies, because of the slow. So I normally do that second. Third item is a bit more of a toss-up, and you can kind of see that here. Thornmail obviously makes sense when you need Grievous Wounds against Darius or a lot of the ADCs that are doing lifesteal, although there's not as many of them currently. Knight's Vow hasn't really changed much. It's still really useful if you have a really fed person on your team. Generally, when you have a 8-0 Vayne or something, you want to do everything you can to keep them alive. This is that item. This does the work for you. Just make sure you don't forget to activate it, because otherwise it's pretty useless. Frozen Heart I haven't actually messed around with much. Again, reducing attack speed, pretty useful. And part of it is just the economics of it currently are really good. I think it probably might fall away a little bit in the next patch, so I would be surprised to keep seeing it quite as much here, but it is a good option. I just haven't played around with it quite as much, to be perfectly honest, so I can't really speak to it too much. But it does seem like a good option. Locket is always just really, really good in terms of shielding. I will build this when I have a squishier team, when I don't have an additional front line that I can rely on for health. But as I pointed out earlier, I think everybody sort of knows this season the damage is just gigantic. So Locket is really useful in helping to mitigate that because of the shield. You can pop it right as you are engaging or to save people from poke or whatever else. I mean, it's the same item it's always been kind of. Gold-wise, it's pretty efficient as well. The reason I don't generally take it as much is because I'm so focused on getting Trailblazer so I can roam, because I want that movement speed. And the additional thing, Lead the Way, I love that. So you get to max speed really quickly with it generally, and you can increase allied champions movement speed by 15% of yours, which is nice. And then your next attack discharges the movement speed, and melee champions slow the target. So our WQ, if we're running out of a bush, for example, on a roam, it's going to give a 50% slow for 1 second, which helps confirm kills when you roam mid or you're roaming with your jungler. It's just a really good roam item, and I'm taking it a lot on engaged supports. And because I prioritize that over being in lane, just the way I play, Locket is generally not something I get, because by the time I'm out of lane phase, I'd rather have Zeke's. And that's just me. So there's 2 things we haven't covered yet. The first is boots, and then the second is what support item would go. Boots, it's funny, boots haven't changed a ton. You can see that popularity for plated steel caps is still pretty high, increasing or reducing incoming damage. I don't actually build these myself very often, because again, I'm not in lane phase as much as some other folks are with Alistar, where you'd get more value out of this. I generally will go either mobility boots or Ionian boots of lucidity. So Ionian boots of lucidity, obviously you get the summoner spell haste, and that is very, very nice. But one thing that's also really nice about this season versus last is Ionian boots of lucidity do have a recipe. You have I think it's called a moat, which is summoner spell haste. You can buy them separately now, whereas before you had to wait till I think it was 650 or something. So that's kind of nice. You can build them out, and I think, I don't know if we have any other items where we need a moat, actually. But if you did on other champions, there's some flexibility there. You can build it into something else if you decide against it. But Moby boots, I think, are still really good. The trade-off really is that Moby boots, you are really investing heavily in the game. You're not giving yourself quite as much wiggle room into the late game to be as useful. Ionian boots for me are a safer bet, and because we're going trailblazer, the loss of the mobility boot movement speed is not as problematic as it was last season when you're roaming, even with non-water walking runes. So I am generally doing trailblazer with Ionian boots because I like having summoner spell haste for later points in the game. But mobility boots also very good the way I play. Obviously, if you're staying in lane more, plated steel caps in tandem with locket makes a ton of sense. Mitigates, AD damage. So there's that. Be nice if there's a support item section. Okay, so I guess there sort of is. So the two that you're generally going, that's not very different from any other engaged support at the moment. It's basically Solstice Slay or Celestial Opposition. So the logic that I was talking about before with Glacial Augment kind of comes into play here again. The advantage of Solstice Slay is obviously you have this going sledding, slowing or immobilizing an enemy champion grants you in a nearby alley with the lowest health, bonus health, and movement speed. So that's really nice. Celestial Opposition, you have the Blessing on the Mountain, which reduces incoming champion damage. It lingers for 2 seconds after taking damage from a champion. It basically just makes you slightly more tanky. Not sure why there's not like a breakdown of who's using this and where. So let me show something that's kind of interesting about Alistar in general. So when we look at professional games, you see that there's a lot of flexibility in terms of what people are building when it comes to support item. You see Solstice Slay a decent amount. You also see Celestial Opposition a decent amount. Sort of like, okay, seems like you could do either one, right? For me, I started the season using Solstice Slay. I figured that the slowing or immobilizing a champion with the health and the move speed would be really useful for running down people, and obviously the logic sort of applied the same way. However, in low elo, and just because I'm not as good as these people, we're looking at pro builds here, I've found that Celestial Opposition just gives me a lot more wiggle room to engage and get out without dying versus Solstice Slay. Blessing of the Mountain with the damage reduction just feels a lot better to me personally, just the way I play. So that's what I've been doing. It kind of flies in the face of a lot of the stuff that you would think would make more sense. But yeah, I've just sort of come to really like this. And when I was watching some of the professional replays, because I watch a decent amount of Alistar replays, particularly when I like lose 2-3 games in a row, I like go and watch a replay to see what their pathing looks like. A lot of the players that play the same way I do will take Celestial Opposition, and there's some nice advantages to that just in terms of like survivability. That being said, what I was saying before about Glacial Augment still makes sense because when you're sort of like an off-tank / playmaker type person, and you have additional help in the late game team fights from another frontliner that can make plays, like a Volley Bear is a good example with the jump in ult thing, or I don't know, Aatrox is pretty strong right now. It's another one. This is a nice advantage to have for the movement speed, as well as just like being value to the team. However, if you're like the sole frontliner, the main frontliner, you're going to die a little bit quicker than if you had Celestial Opposition. And so I've found personally that when you apply that to low elo and just like the skill gap between people that are like we're looking at here, like Hillisang or like Limit, who play like very, very clean Alistars based on the need that is there, versus like me playing in Diamond in NA, I've found that just like I need to have the additional damage reduction to keep myself from dying 8 times. It's the difference between dying 8 times in a game and dying like 3 times in a game for me generally. So, and I guess my recommendation to lower elo players that are playing Alistar is like probably just take this. It's just going to be safer. And then you also, the other advantage of it is that you don't have to really worry about somebody else. I think that's like a big part of the way that itemization on Alistar just sort of like makes sense is like in lower elo, we've been talking a lot about like team comps and like things like that. Like we probably don't want to rely on a lot of other people to play frontline properly. So like this is, you know, okay, I have a lot of like bruisers in my front line and I can help them make plays by, you know, giving them move speed and giving them bonus health. And it's like, okay, to what degree do you want to be helpful versus to what degree do you want to be the person, like the main person making plays who's in there first trying to find plays? I would argue that in like silver and gold, if you're serious about climbing, that should be you, in which case Celestial Opposition makes more sense. It's the same reason, going back to the runes, that I was sort of suggesting that, you know, go with this page because you're going to get better survivability for the Aftershock, Bone Plating, Unflinching than with Glacial Augment, right? That being said, like, you know, it's flexible, right? But I think in general, there's like a lot of patterns that you see here. You know, obviously Locket, Knight's Vow, Zeke's, you see them in almost every game in some capacity. And then Trailblazer, I think, is sort of the, if you're serious about roaming, you take it. Interestingly, you see a lot of pro players here are now going Boots of Swiftness. That's a newer one. I can't really speak to that yet. I haven't really seen that as much, but here you see a lot of Ionian as well, both in Korea and in NA. So obviously it's important. I mean, this is like 14.2-ish when we're discussing this right now. Things are going to change, but it's funny, even with all the new changes that have been made, there hasn't been like a huge change to how Alistar works. You can basically itemize him and rune him two ways at a high level, right? One is playmaker off tank, one is main tank, damage dealer and slower. Like he's like a tankier Rakan. That's generally sort of how I play him with Trailblazer to roam. So hopefully that helps in terms of how you think about him. It's funny, like often there was a couple moments here where like this was the only page that Riot was showing in their like suggested runes for him, which I think is a little bit misleading. I mean, obviously there's still 30% popularity on this versus 46% popularity on Glacial. I just think in solo queue, just be prepared to like die a little bit more with these runes if you don't have somebody who's going to follow up your plays, and that's super frustrating in low elo for sure. Whereas this, you have a little bit more flexibility to engage. Oh shit, I did it wrong. Like maybe you'll get away. Whereas here, probably not. So hopefully this was helpful. I don't know, like if you're thinking about playing Alistar, I hope you do. I think he's a really, really underrated and awesome champion just in terms of the amount of impact he has across the entire rift from like level 3 or 4 on. Really easy to make plays once you have the WQ combo down versus like a Rakan or something where if you don't land your W, like you're just kind of screwed. Alistar, it's very difficult to mess up the WQ combo. You can literally just go into practice tool and practice it on dummies like for like 20 minutes and you pretty much have it down. Yeah, so give them a try. Hopefully these runes help. Let me know how it goes too. I'd be interested to hear